Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Cyber Resilience for the Next Wave of Ransomware, Kubernetes. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar in partnership with Zerto, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the moderator. As always, we want these events to be educational, and we encourage your questions there in the questions pane. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the event, so make sure that you get your questions in early. I know that this is a really cutting-edge topic, and it's a hot topic out there for so many companies out there, protecting your company's data from ransomware, and specifically today, of course, around cloud-native applications running Kubernetes. So before we get started, I also want to point out in the handouts tab, you've got a link there to the Zerto backup and disaster recovery for Kubernetes landing page, as well as a PDF resource that you can download on exactly how this solution works. So you might want to go ahead and just click on those resources and check them out before we get started. And then at the end of the webinar, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, the drawing has already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab. And then we also have an additional prize for an Amazon $50 gift card for a best question prize winner. So of course you have to ask a question to be entered into that prize drawing, and we'll be contacting winners after the event via email. You of course must also meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. Now, our expert presenter today is Mr. Andy Fernandez, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Zerto. And Andy, it's great to have you on the event. Before we kick it off, before I hand it off to Andy, I've got a few poll questions for everyone out there in the audience to help Andy really shape his presentation to the needs of you and the needs of your company. And the first question is on the screen here. The question is, are you using Kubernetes persistent volumes to store your data for persistent stateful applications? A simple yes or no question. And I'll let everyone respond to this. If you haven't responded to these types of polls before, you just do it right there in the slides window. Select the option that corresponds to you and your company. And I will share the results, and you can kind of see how you compare to your peers who are on the event today. All right, thank you to everyone who responded there to that poll. Let me share the results, and it looks like 18%, almost 20% are using Kubernetes persistent volumes. Roughly 80% aren't using persistent volumes at this point. Next question here, have you rolled backup policies for containerized applications? Yes, no, or not quite sure. And so, whoops, let me bring that poll back up. There we go. Give everyone a chance to respond to that. All right, thank you to everyone who responded to that one. It looks like the results are in here, and 12% say yes, 60% no, 27% not quite sure. A couple more questions here. One is, are you using Kubernetes availability as your default data protection use case? So are you implementing data protection primarily to protect Kubernetes, or are you using Kubernetes tools, native tools, to protect Kubernetes? All right. Thank you to everyone who responded to that. Roughly 80% not using Kubernetes availability as your default data protection use case. And then last question before I hand it off to Andy, and that is, what Kubernetes platforms are you using? So when it comes to running Kubernetes, where are you doing it? On what? And this is a multi-select question here, so feel free to select more than one. All righty, thank you to everyone who responded here to the polls. We do appreciate your feedback. Let me share the results of this last poll. And it looks like kind of a good distribution across the board. OpenShift and AKS and VMware Tanzu, kind of the leaders there. Hopefully that helps you to shape your presentation to the needs of our audience. Andy, it's great to have you on. I'll hand it off to you. Take it away.
Welcome, everybody. Really happy to have you here. We're grateful for your time. The title of today's event is Cyber Resilience for the Next Wave of Ransomware within Kubernetes. And what we're really going to talk about today is what is the state of data protection ransomware recovery right now for K8s. And I'm really happy that we're able to participate in those poll questions because it falls exactly in line with the conversations we've been having with prospects, customers, and really where the industry is and the maturity of the use of containerized applications in Kubernetes. So with that, quick introduction. My name is Andy Fernandez. I'm Senior Product Marketing Manager at Zerto, a Hewlett-Packard enterprise company. So with that, I know we don't have too much time, so I want to get right into our discussion. And what I want to start is essentially where we started off with our poll question, which is talking about where are people actually utilizing Kubernetes right now within persistency adoption, right? Are they in a phase where they're talking about and explicitly using stateless K8s, or are we getting to a point where an organization is using persistent volumes? That is an extremely distributed proportion right now, as we saw in the poll. I was at KubeCon 2 weeks ago. I believe it was 2 weeks ago, and we were able to, sorry, there's a time slide issue here. We were able to really understand where everyone sits. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about this. We know that there's core 4 stages, right, of the evolution from the pure stateless Kubernetes deployments all the way to Kubernetes persistent volumes. And in between, we've also got some persistency living in other places, right, whether it's living within VMs or in database as a services. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper, and I think based on the poll questions, we understand organizations are already using stateless K8s as well. And so with that, let's talk about persistent volumes, right? Because this is the point where we get into that we actually have to start talking about availability and data protection. And so what we see here is the final step in this evolution is truly getting that entire application to follow a true service microservices architecture. That includes persistent data. So not only do you have the components that do not require state running as containers, but also the stateful ones with use of persistent volumes that are running as containers. This allows you to do 2 things, really. One, it obviously gives you the freedom of choice so that the containerized workload can be deployed anywhere, on premises, in one cloud service provider, another cloud provider, back onto prem, physical, with a hypervisor, without a hypervisor. You can even make it mobile, but also including the database components as part of your CI/CD application pipeline. So just as you would test and deploy application and front-end changes, you can also deploy the database changes in that manner. So you really have truly achieved the separation of DevOps in an IT role. Now, I know that there are a lot of folks in this audience right now who have yet to adopt this, but it is important to understand where are we all going as an industry with the adoption of persistent volumes. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about persistent data, stateful sets, and what that means. But before we get excited, right, we have to start thinking about the protection of that persistent data. Once it's there, what do you do with it? How do you make sure that you remain resilient? So while from an evolutionary standpoint, having that persistent data can be part of the container really provides a lot of flexibility and scale, as opposed to locking into specific paths or SaaS services, or even locking the data on the VM side, right, which is a bit of an antiquated approach to doing so. We now have to think about the resilience. What happens if something goes down, whether it's downtime or data loss? And by resilience, we have to think about the ability to back that up, to restore it. How do I replicate this from a disaster recovery standpoint to be able to fail that over, fail that back, or even provide mobility and migration services? And as more containerized workloads move from test dev into lower tier production and even into higher tier, critical production applications, these aspects become important because it's your data, right? So it has to follow the same governance rules that existed on your physical workloads, on your virtualized workloads, and now on your containerized workloads as well. So Kubernetes, we already know that as users that it is amazing when it comes to being able to automate deployment, to scale, load balance, to be able to monitor these workloads, even managing the storage via CSI drivers as persistent volumes, or I'm just going to say PVs for the rest of this presentation. But also the claim mechanism, as well as being able to ensure that these services are networks between pods and across pods that provide. However, what Kubernetes does not do a good job of today is ensuring that you have a native method in order to back up this persistent data, in order to back up not just the data, but the configurations themselves of the deployed applications. extending that to not being able to provide DR across clusters. And mobility, whether it be for one time, for expansion, or for even burst capabilities across clusters, or even across platforms, right? Say from on-prem to public, or even across public cloud providers. So these are some of the gaps that we're talking about when it comes to what can Zerto do for your organization. And maybe some of you are already very familiar with Zerto from the VMware perspective or for Hyper-V. But Zerto has over a decade established dominance in the market, providing continuous data protection, right? For DR, for backup, for long-term retention, for mobility, and all those core capabilities and outcomes that we've unlocked for a decade. We're extending them over to Kubernetes and those new applications as we see a growth there. Now, you may be asking me, well, there's a potential here where we don't really need the same type of backup or DR policies that you have because they're not the same threats. But the reality is that they are significant threats that we're encountering within Kubernetes environments. And what we're seeing is, just as we saw a hockey stick growth in VMware-based attacks in the past, we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing an increase in both the volume, the frequency, and the severity of these attacks that are explicitly targeting Kubernetes clusters. They're going and essentially activating malicious Kubernetes clusters and taking down these environments and their data as well. So, we have to move away from the beginning where we thought that Kubernetes did not require any type of purpose-built data protection, didn't need any of that because, it's a different architecture, a different service. But the truth is that as Kubernetes and these containerized applications become even more popular, as organizations are using them for production applications, it's more important than ever that we look towards a maturity of being able to actually protect these workloads, because these attacks are only going to get more frequent and they're only going to get more targeted. And most cyber criminal syndicates have an understanding that a majority of organizations are not protecting this data because they seem to be relying on Kubernetes or not really thinking that they need to roll DR and backup policies into that. So with that in mind, we need to talk about what do you have to actually look for in a data protection solution? What does that actually mean? What are some of the challenges there? And so with that, we should start our Kubernetes story talking about why we moved into this space, right? We've seen an explosive growth. It's been kind of a wild west within the DevOps world around how is this going to be used? How is this going to mature? And I've talked already about why, Kubernetes has some resilience out of the box, right? But the resilience that I've mentioned is really resilience when it comes to things like pods. It does high availability pretty well, but it's extremely limited in terms of backup and recovery. And I'll give you an example. For disaster recovery, you could, in theory, stitch together a series of scripts and manually maintain those as a patchwork solution. But that is not an enterprise grade approach. It's not even a midsize or an SMB approach. Anything that requires customized scripting for one specific department or organization and manual intervention is not something that is sustainable, especially as we see a continued growth and adoption of Kubernetes within these environments. Now, that is just expected to use the limited backup and recovery options that Kubernetes applied. But what about the other solutions that are out there from allegedly purpose-built protection perspective? Well, the existing solutions on that market, they address this challenge, but they're not purpose-built for Kubernetes. These options are mostly drawn from the VM domain. Sorry, I keep getting these issues here. And they're drawn from the VM world, right? Not the container domain. So some clouds are offering Kubernetes as a service, do include some cross-region replication at an added expense, but that's certainly not a vendor-agnostic approach. The name of the game with containers is portability. So being locked into one cloud's way of doing things is not what most enterprises are looking to do these days. And in terms of other options, certainly there are other legacy players acquiring new Kubernetes solutions and then trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So that's where you see a reliance on storage snapshots or protecting the underlying VMs with no consideration for containers. So when you think about this, the other component is, what about protecting the application? Ignoring the application is a common issue within Kubernetes, especially around data protection. Because when you recover only the persistent data, it's a surefire way to prolong your recovery process. Everything that makes up an enterprise application, including the deployments, config maps, services, and so on, they need to be restored together. And they need to be done so from the same point in time rather than staggered across some backup window. So in fact, Zerto is really abandoning the notion of backup windows altogether. So let's move into what Zerto is actually delivering. And what we're focused on doing is delivering the exact same value add that we've done so in the past around virtualized applications, right? It's around continuous data protection. And what we're doing here is we're offering native backup, native DR, long-term retention, and mobility of next generation applications that are using persistent data. We also have use cases for non-persistent data as well, for stateless. But regardless of whether that data is running on premises or in the cloud or a mix of both, Zerto for Kubernetes, which is the product that we've released earlier this year and we've continued to release new versions, is available for all the leading platforms. Everything from Azure EKS, Google, GKE, AWS, EKS, IBM, Red Hat OpenShift. We've also added support for VMware Tanzu, RookSF, you name it. So it's really critical that we're able to support all of these from a consistent perspective as well. Now, I've kind of told you what we're doing and why we're doing it, but I want to kind of dive in a little bit too more as to how and what continuous data protection means when it comes to the world of containers. And let's spend a little bit of time on this because, in the virtual machine market, vendors are starting to agree with us that this is the right approach, not using backup legacy snapshot technology to provide resilience. It's proven to lead to too much downtime, and it's proven to lead to very difficult recovery time objectives as well, right? It's as important that you can get your data back, but very, very important that you can get running quickly. And continuous data protection is what has allowed us to differentiate that model, not only for VMs, but now also for Kubernetes as well. Now, with CDP, our customers, they're getting more automated, consistent, non-disruptive recovery of their applications and their data. And that is both um, within and between clusters, data centers, and cloud. And there's really three core aspects to true CDP. And this applies both to the virtualization world, but also to the containerized world as well. At the core of what we do, really the engine and how we treat the data is our near synchronous replication, right? Think of being able to continuously replicate data using block level replication and observing changes every 5 seconds. And the reason we say near synchronous replication with Zerto is because you get the immediacy of synchronous replication, but you get the performance and the easy recoverability of asynchronous replication. So think of just thousands and thousands of recovery points that you can select from to be able to fail over a Kubernetes application or restore specific aspects of that application. But because it's always on, you're getting very granular checkpoints, as I mentioned, thousands of them. And the way that we allow you to be able to recover that is via a dynamic journal. Think of it as a log of all block level changes. So as we talked about, this is not gaps of hours, this is gaps of seconds, every 5 seconds, that allows you to say, if I understand there was a moment of encryption or something went down, I can simply roll back 5 seconds and get that up and running as quickly as possible. When we start moving and seeing containerized applications for mission critical workloads, that's when we know we need enterprise grade availability, being able to get something up quickly because any added downtime is revenue that is lost, is productivity that is lost, and is also an impact on reputation as well. So think of these three as the core tenets of CDP. How are you replicating your data? Are you using a journal mechanism to be able to recover? And you're making sure that you're eliminating as much data loss and downtime as possible. So these are things to keep in mind as well. But now I've talked about this in the sense of this is very similar to the VM side and containers, but what about Zerto for Kubernetes that makes it specific to Kubernetes and purpose built? Well, first and foremost, we approach this as data protection as code. This means that this is purpose built for Kubernetes. This is not something that is an add-on on how we're able to protect the VM. No, we're protecting Kubernetes applications natively with declarative management on the backup and DR side as well. Now you also have an application-centric approach, as we've talked about. We want you to be able to protect your K8 application as a whole, rather than simply the persistent volumes or the underlying VMs only, because we know that's not true resilience, not true native resilience. And then there's also the simple workflow. How can we make you do this or allow you to do this in a simple way that doesn't require significant administrative overhead? That's where our automation comes in. We give you the ability to have recovery and orchestration workflows for point-in-time restores. Whether you're failing over entire application or performing a test or a simple restore, it's all done in a minimal amount of steps. Another really core important characteristics of what we're doing is hybrid and multi-cloud, that we're delivering native support for these K8 environments, whether it's on premises, in the cloud, or both. And then ultimately, you need to be able to have the ability to, one, have API integration. How can you modify this? How can you improve upon this and integrate into your existing DevOps practice? And making sure that you also have the visibility with deep analytics as well. So these are kind of the core high level reasons as to why Zerto differentiates. But let's take a look at the architecture as well, because the architecture is crucial to understand how this works. Now, as a native Kubernetes application, Zerto runs on your clusters as a set of pods, services, daemons, etc. And usually this will be in its own namespace to keep separation from other resources. Where you deploy Zerto is entirely up to you. That's really important. Where you deploy Zerto is completely entirely up to you. The control plane called Zerto Kubernetes Manager, you see that on the left side there, or the ZKM. You can also host the ZKM in a different region of production or on its own standalone cluster, even when running on a different cloud than everyone else. With the ZKM, we also deploy Keycloak. It's a leading solution for identity and access management that we're all familiar with. And as you might expect, there are databases for everything, specifically Postgres databases. And to install Zerto, it's as easy as pulling from Helm and configuring just a couple key variables, right? Either on the CLI or via YAML. You only need really one ZKM and Keycloak instance since there are Zerto-wide deployments, no matter the platform or the cloud. There's flexibility there. On each cluster, though, you'll also have a ZKM proxy, and that ZKM proxy interfaces with a central ZKM. And alongside the proxies are the replication engines themselves, right? These are the VRA pods with their journals and replicas. These are the real powerhouses behind the Zerto continuous data protection. Think of these as the replication engines and the data movers. These are the reasons you'll see the 5 to 15-second RPOs with Zerto that are unmatched in the industry. And like all Zerto components, these VRAs are extremely lightweight and add almost no overhead to your nodes. And lastly, keep in mind that this diagram, you'll see the physical storage layer. Zerto is completely agnostic to what kind of storage that is, other than requiring block storage. But the exact kind or the vendor, it's completely up to you. And you're free to change later on as needed rather than being locked in. In principle, the focus here is to make sure that you are able to run this on whichever infrastructure and architecture you're wanting to use, that Zerto remains portable, that it remains lightweight, but that allows your environment to remain available as well. And just as a quick summary, that's where we see why Zerto for Kubernetes. And there's three core reasons, right? We've seen the three product reasons for CDP around replication, around journaling, around removing data loss. But really, I want to summarize this around the first and most important thing you should be looking at. Whether you're not ready for a purpose-built data protection solution because you're explicitly using stateless K8s, but if you're thinking about it or you are ready, it's important to think about a couple of design principles that I'll go over. But the three most important outcomes, the first one being continuous availability. In my environment, can I protect against any disruption, like a ransomware attack? Whether this disruption is planned or unplanned, am I able to continue keeping my applications up and running? Whether that's to make sure that revenue remains or we have an always-on customer experience. That availability is the most important mission of these applications. Can they remain running? But another really important outcome is operational efficiency. How do we keep the lights on? How do we remain available with less people, with less processes, and less tools? How can I streamline this into DevOps workflow and not just add an entirely different widget, tool, and GUI that organizations need to spend more time? How can we make the minimal steps required to deliver the most availability? And the third most important thing is multi-cloud agility. We know that we make infrastructure decisions, we make workload platform decisions, and sometimes we regret them, and we want to be able to move. With Zerto, you're able to protect them wherever infrastructure you choose, but more importantly, you're also able to move across different types of platforms as well. And that's a really important aspect that we're seeing many organizations adopt. Now, I'm going to reiterate a couple of things here, just because I know that in this audience today, we have organizations at completely different steps from, not having any type of stateful data or persistent volumes, all the way to having persistent volumes and you already having backup and DR policies for that. So I'm going to share a couple more design principles, just so whether it's Zerto or somebody else, you have an understanding of what you should be looking for. That's not a modified VM solution, but that's something that's native. And the first design principle, as I talked about, is making sure that this is continuous protection. That this is continuous protection. That one is not using storage snapshots or any type of snapshot. Snapshot technology, whether in the physical or virtualized world, has been here for decades. We've only seen iterative improvements of this, but it only introduces significant data loss. Think about this. For example, if there's a ransomware attack and you're doing a backup every day. If you're able to identify the checkpoint that you can recover from, even if you're able to perform a successful recovery, you've already lost hours of days, right? Because you're depending on a daily backup window. That's why having replication, granular checkpoints of every few seconds is extremely critical. The other piece too is being able to not just have thousands of these recovery points to choose from, but also a checkpoint and tagging mechanism to be able to quickly access and recover them. And also an ordered recovery of applications. You don't want to encounter the situation where you have different components of your Kubernetes applications being snapshotted at completely different points in time. That's absolutely useless when it comes to being able to quickly recover these applications. So we know continuous protection or continuous data protection is a key design principle here, especially when we're talking about something like ransomware. But then we're also encountering the environmental awareness, right? That's another key capability is, am I using storage agnostic volume consistency? Do I have the flexibility to move away from this when this doesn't convenience me, whether it's from a financial reason, from a compute reason, or just different types of decisions and features that you have to decide for your company? And then you have to think about, am I protecting the entire K8 app, right? There are a lot of open source tools out there that provide some protection, but they do not protect the entire Kubernetes applications. Everything from configs to secrets, you have to be able to protect the entire application. And that the way that you're doing that is through protection groups. How do I make sure that I designate all the components of this application and then instantly just replicate them as one stack? And then the third, APIs and automation. That's an extremely important component as well. As we know, we're still figuring out, who is the person, who is the role that is responsible for protecting these applications. Is that DevOps? Is it somebody in the middle? Is it your site reliability engineers? Or is it your traditional IT managers and admins? Who is that? That's extremely varied across organizations. I'd love to hear your input. But what we're seeing is, regardless of what that decision is, especially in the DevOps world, the solution that you choose to deliver resilience for your Kubernetes applications has to be API enabled, has to be automated. And that's where you have your data protection as code experience. Because if you don't have a data protection as code, what I mean by that is, as you are deploying these applications, they are being protected. You are spending more time, more resources, and introducing more risk. So by making sure that you streamline this to find a solution that's data protection as code is extremely important. And in order to be able to accomplish that, you need an API extensibility platform. You need the ability to have declarative configuration. Can I do this all in command line? Can I do this as I deploy? These are really important things to ask yourself before you make any big decision. And ultimately, the last design principle we have is, make sure you choose a native solution. Make sure you choose something that's not, storage snapshot based, or something that's just protecting the underlying VM of this, but that it's designed to protect K8 applications, purpose built for it, right? At Zerto, we made sure that we didn't just simply kind of modify our existing solution to protect the underlying VM and then, slap on Kubernetes name on there and call that a product. That's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to drive a native purpose-built solution that took the best of Zerto that people loved for their virtualized applications and brought it into a native Kubernetes environment. So being able to have platform independence and being able to scale is going to be extremely crucial. I think we all know this as Kubernetes become much more standard for these mission critical workloads, scale is going to be extremely necessary. So this is the last design principle, the last decision criteria I've shared with you, right? I've talked about continuous data protection, environment awareness, APIs and automation, but mostly going native and being able to do so. So with that, I'm going to provide some resources, but I really want to thank you for your time, your involvement, especially your poll questions, because it's really important to be able to see, what our organization is doing now. But I do want to share a couple important resources for you. And those resources, the first one is our hands-on lab. I could sit here and from a marketing perspective, talk about why we're better, why you should pick us. But at the end of the day, you should explicitly try out our hands-on labs. This doesn't require any additional infrastructure. Go on browser, click the URL, and you can check out an on-demand lab. Understand explicitly how we treat this data. What does a restore look like? What does a failover test look like with Zerto? And you'll really get an understanding of how lightweight, how portable, how easy this is for you to be able to use. Whether you're a traditional Zerto user on the virtual side, or you're somebody in the DevOps organization responsible for this. We also have a lot of thought leadership material on, stateless versus stateful. How do you protect? Why you should protect? What are some of these scenarios? So I really invite you to see all of our content. That's not really salesy. It's not focused on that. It's just focused on, understanding where does the industry sit right now? What are the best practices and how we can help? And if you actually want to see it in action, maybe in your environment, we also have a live tailored demo available for you too, and we'd love to do that. But the most important thing out of all of this is to make sure that we talk about the labs as well. So with that, I'm going to take a look at any additional questions that we have. See a lot of hellos as well, so I appreciate that. I have some that are very specific to certain use cases, and I will make sure to send you a response explicitly when you're asking, right, how can containers scan ports and things like that. I'll get you kind of a full by full description of that. But here's a specific question. Does the implementation of Zerto for Kubernetes require much IT specialist training? It depends on what your industry is, but let's put it this way. It isn't Zerto historically, we've prided ourselves on being a very fast and easy installation process, right? Zerto traditionally does not require any professional services. Even for VM deployments at the enterprise level, you can be up in an hour and replicating anywhere. It's the same. It's a very easy install, very easy configuration. So I say that if you check out our on-demand labs, read some of our documentation, I think it'll be perfect. But obviously, we always have additional support and capabilities to help you make sure you're accurately protecting this. I see one here by Chris. This is actually a really good question. And it's lots of companies present different ways and various solutions to deal with ransomware attacks like DR and backup systems. Is there a better method to stop ransomware at the source? That is a good insight and a good question. And here's the reality. Zerto is not prevention. Any company that is DR, backup, resilience, and it's telling you that they're stopping ransomware is not providing the truth. What it's doing is just telling you something different. What we do is allow you to recover and have resilience for the moment, not if, but when there is an intrusion and encryption event. That's a really big thing to differentiate. And the reason we say that is you should still have solutions focused on prevention, on malware scanning, and then have your recovery solution, right, when you think NIST framework. Not having just one solution for all these things will not be the best option to do so. So we always recommend that as much as you invest in recovery technology, that's extremely important. Also invest in prevention and those best practices as well. But that's a really good question, Chris. And we see another question around appliance and cloud. So these are, when I say an appliance, I mean these are virtual and containerized appliances that sit within the architecture that are lightweight, right? Very, very small installations, and this can run on premise or in cloud, right? This is not a hardware-based solution that's able to do so. Let's see. There's a couple of more questions that are even more specific, so I'll make sure to get to you and provide a lot more feedback and kind of step by step there, but I want to make sure I give you the right answer. So with that in mind, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I hope this won't be the last time that we chat, and I'll reach out to each of you with additional answers to your questions. And I also see here the poll on what you're looking to see. So with that in mind, I want to thank you so much for your time, and I'll hand this over to David.
Yeah, great presentation, Andy. Really enjoyed that. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience did as well. I know many companies out there are at different stages, of course, in their kind of journey to cloud native applications. So this has been a great event and a great topic. I want to remind everyone of the poll question that's up there on the screen right now. We encourage your response to that. We do want to hear your feedback. And feel free to select more than one option out there. Also, of course, thank you for all the excellent questions that have come in for Andy and the Zerto team. We'll be routing the questions we didn't have time for, of course, over to Andy, and we'll be reaching out to our best question prize winner as well. So let's see, before we wrap up, I do want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. This gift card is going out to Charles Heller. Congratulations, Charles Heller. We'll reach out to you to deliver your gift card. And of course, also to the best question prize winner as well. If you haven't responded there to the poll, we do appreciate your feedback on that still as well. Before you go, thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us on the webinar today on cyber resilience for the next wave of ransomware, specifically protecting Kubernetes. Thank you, of course, to Zerto for supporting the event today. A great presentation, Andy, and thank you to everyone out there in the audience as well. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.